If you have your Bible, we're in Matthew chapter 5. We're working through a series in the Gospel of Matthew called The Kingdom of Heaven, particularly a little series within that of the Sermon on the Mount called Kingdom Life. So far in the sermon, we walked through the Beatitudes, what it means to be the light of the world, and then we got into what we might call the body of the sermon last week and Christ's kind of thesis statement. We'll recap that here in a moment, but have a interesting question. Kind of, everybody's going to have their own self-perception on this to begin with. Who thinks you're a good driver? Right now, there's some of you that would be willing to raise your hand here. What's the basis for thinking you're a good driver? Right? Many of you would say, I think I probably am a pretty good driver. What do you base that off of? Right? Would you say, well, people say they enjoy riding with me, right? So people have told me I'm a good driver. Or I've only gotten a few tickets, or maybe 0 tickets in my life, right? I generally follow the rules while I'm on the road. Are those the things that make you a good driver? You say never met one? Oh, that's what. I thought you said never met a good driver. That's probably true too. Right, so I want you to think for a moment though. Because based on, all of us have our own standard, right? So it's, well, I follow the law, or people say this, or if you follow all the laws of the road, but inside your car, you're making rude gestures and saying rude words, taking phone calls, texting, are you a good driver? But you followed all the rules of the road. Right? But that doesn't make you a good driver, right? Who wants to ride with somebody like that? Right? Just because you follow the rules of the road, if that's the kind of person you are in the car, doesn't mean that I want to ride with you, right? And that's kind of the point today. Hopefully your answer is no. That's not a good driver just because they follow the rules. Right? And we're getting into a little bit more of the details of Christ talking about what does it mean to actually live the law? Right? A lot of times we think living the law is just, I haven't got any tickets. Right? We think of God as the police officer, like, well, you followed all the rules of the road, so you must be a good driver, right? You must be living according to the law. But what we find out with Jesus here is God cares about what's going on inside the car, even if you're just following the rules on the outside. Right? God cares about the person you're being inside the car. That's what determines whether you're actually living according to the law or not. Now, like I said, Christ gave us kind of a thesis last week. And I want to recap that briefly because there was a lot of you not here with the weather, and I understand, but we can't miss everything we're going to look at today and in the coming weeks is based off of what we saw last week. So if you want to go back, that sermon's posted on YouTube and our Facebook page. You can listen to the whole thing that way. But I'll recap it for you this morning. In Matthew chapter 5, verse 20, Jesus says, I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. So you must have a greater righteousness than what the scribes, Pharisees, the religious leaders of the day had. Well, guess what? You can't do that on your own. That's what we saw last week, even from the very beginning with the Beatitudes. We saw you are poor in spirit. You can't produce that righteousness on your own. Thus, Christ comes, back to verse 17, he says, I have not come to abolish the law, but I have come to fulfill the law. Right? So Christ says, now I want you to fulfill the law. You must have a greater righteousness, but I have come to do that for you. Yet, in the following verse 19, he goes on to say, not just do I fulfill it, but now I call on you to fulfill it. He says, whoever relaxes on one of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever does them and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. Right? So Jesus is saying here, not just he's come to fulfill the law, but now he's saying, now you do the law, but you can't do that on your own. So that's where Christ as the fulfiller of the law comes into play. Two pieces to that. This is what we looked at last week. Christ fully lives the law. Right? He is the complete fulfillment of the law. He lives the perfect life. He never did a single thing that made him unholy. He never once had an idol, never once lost his devotion to the Father. None of it. That's what he means when I came to fulfill the law. Thus, when Jesus goes to the cross, he fulfills the law in being the spotless lamb that can be sacrificed on our behalf. At the cross, he takes the judgment that the law demands for us as sinners, and for those who believe in Jesus, his righteousness is gifted to us. So God looks at you and declares you to be righteous under the law because Christ's righteousness has been gifted to you by faith. Now that's the first piece. Christ fulfills the law and then gifts us his righteousness. But the second part is then Christ enables us to now live by the law. So it's not just you're declared righteous, everything's fine. It's now that you've been declared righteous, live out that righteousness. Live the law as you've been called to do. So by Christ working in us through his Spirit, he produces righteousness in us. So now that leads to the question, well, what does it look like practically to live out the law? What are some examples of living out the law as Christ has put his righteousness in us and now we seek to walk in it? So what we're going to see really through the rest of the body of the Sermon on the Mount is illustrations and examples of what it means to live out the righteousness. The first 6 examples are what it means to live the law. Jesus is going to say, you've heard it was written, you've heard it said this, and he's going to start naming laws from the Old Testament. Okay, so the first 6 examples are that. So that's what we're going to spend 2 weeks getting into. We're going to do the first 3 of them today. So that's where it brings us to Matthew chapter 5, verse 21. So we're going to start there and read through verse 32. Matthew 5, verse 21. You have heard that it was said of those of old, you shall not murder, and whoever murders will be liable to judgment. But I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother will be liable to judgment. Whoever insults his brother will be liable to the council, and whoever says, you fool, will be liable to the hell of fire. So, if you are offering your gift at the altar, and there remember that your brother has something against you, leave your gift there before the altar and go. First be reconciled to your brother, and then come and offer your gift. Come to terms quickly with your accuser while you are going with him to court, lest your accuser hand you over to the judge and the judge to the guard, and you be put in prison. Truly, I say to you, you will never get out until you have paid the last penny. You have heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery. But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lustful intent has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye causes you to sin, tear it out and throw it away. For it is better that you lose one of your members than that your whole body be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. For it is better that you lose one of your members than that your whole body go into hell. It was also said, whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce. But I say to you that everyone who divorces his wife, except on the ground of sexual immorality, makes her commit adultery. And whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. Now, most of you have probably heard those laws laid out before and have seen illustrations of them or seen or heard teachings about them. I want to focus first on kind of a general encompassment of all of it, that this is not a new law. That's what often the temptation is in the Old Testament it said don't murder, but now Jesus gives a new law that says don't be angry. Right? That's not at all what's happening here. Jesus is explaining what it looks like to fulfill the law of the Old Testament. Jesus is revealing what the heart of the Old Testament law was really about. So it's not, well, the Old Testament worked one way and now it works a different way. It's always worked this way. It's just you misunderstood it until now, and I'm revealing to you, right, what is the proper understanding of it. And what he reveals the heart of the law is to us first is that it's more than moral conduct. The Pharisees lived by what some of us in our society would call, quote unquote, morality. Don't murder, don't commit adultery. If you want a divorce, just make sure you get a certificate with the divorce, right? That's what it looks like to live the law according to the religious leaders. But you hear Jesus in these examples say what? That's not enough. It's not enough that you just didn't murder. It's not enough that you just don't commit adultery. It must go deeper than that. He says it's not just about murder, it's about anger. Right? It's not just about committing adultery, it's what's going on in your thoughts and in your heart before you ever step into those actions. These are issues that go on inside of people. You can conduct yourself outwardly in a moral way and still be in sin, is what Jesus is saying. The heart of the law, from Old Testament all the way into the New, the heart of the law is wholeness. And we've already touched on this when we were overviewing the Sermon on the Mount, but these 6 examples from the law are going to end in Matthew 5, verse 48. So just look over at it. You therefore must be perfect, as your heavenly Father is perfect. But that word perfect could be translated whole. God is undivided in what he does. Right? It's not that God's heart is split of, well, this and this, or I'm going to act this way, but my heart's really here. Right? God's not divided in what he does. And he says, neither should you be. You should not conduct yourself in a moral way, but have your heart still be in a sinful way. Right? That's not what he's after. Our conduct is supposed to be driven by our hearts, not detached from our hearts. And Jesus illustrates to us what it looks like to live this perfectly. Jesus is never once divided. His heart and his conduct are always in line with each other. And then he says, I'm now going to transform you so that you can live the same way, so that your heart can align with the conduct that you're supposed to be doing. So as I was contemplating these 3 kind of illustrations that Jesus gives, there's 3 things that kept coming to mind that I think might be helpful of what it means for us to live the law from the heart. Right? So 3 things, and there's more to it, but these 3 things kept coming to mind. First of all, it means attention. How many of us have to give much attention throughout our day to make sure we don't murder someone? Probably not much, hopefully not much. If you have to get a lot of attention to it, we need to talk afterwards, okay? But hopefully not much, right? You can just go throughout your day without giving much attention. Yeah, I didn't kill anybody today. How much attention does it require to make sure you're not angry with someone throughout the day? So it requires attention. It requires consistency, right? It may not require much consistency to be like, yeah, I didn't commit adultery today. How much consistency does it require from you to say, I didn't look at someone that's not my spouse the wrong way? That's a much more consistent need than just saying, yeah, I didn't commit any acts of adultery. And third is intentionality. Intentionality. You see, you could see this in all 3 of these, but I want to illustrate it by the certificate of divorce. It was really easy. It required no effort, no intentionality to sign a certificate of divorce and send the woman on her way for the Jewish man. But Jesus is saying, actually, I want you to stay. I want you to stay with the person you're married to. I don't want you to just easily sign off on the certificate and send her. Now, to stay with someone in marriage requires a lot of intentionality, yes? Yes, if you're doing it the right way, at least. So, all this to say, living the law is an all-day, everyday pursuit. It requires all of you all the time. Think of it kind of like I was reading through this week of Israel in the wilderness as they're about to go into the wilderness in the book of Numbers. And I caught this detail, and I'd read it before, but it stuck out in my mind again. It was talking about how the cloud and the fire, right, surrounded the tabernacle, the tent of meeting. And whenever it would rise up, right, they were supposed to all start packing up and head on their way, right? But it said they had to watch the cloud and the fire by day or by night to make sure as soon as it lifted up, they would be on their way. Just imagine how watchful you had to be. That was all day, every day. Somebody in the community has to be watching the cloud or the fire to say, oh, it's on its way up. We got to start packing and get ready. Or think of it kind of like, we kind of joke about it, and hopefully most of us can laugh at ourselves. First-time parents tend to be a little more watchful than third-time parents with their children, right? And we all chuckle at it, right? Because first-time parents are kind of like hover helicopter parents sometimes, right? They're paying attention to every detail. Okay, make sure they don't touch this, make sure they don't eat this, make sure they don't get into this, right? But what if God actually wants you to be that way about your heart? God wants you to be that watchful, saying, okay, sure, I didn't murder anybody, but am I angry? Am I having wrong thoughts here? Am I being careless in this area? How consistent are you in contemplating your heart? Is the question. So Jesus gives us 6 examples from the law, 3 of them that we're going to look at today. The first one, the reconciling heart, you see from the commandment very quickly, right? Very familiar commandment. All of us know this commandment from the 10 Commandments, don't we? Do not murder. And now Jesus isn't saying, I'm abolishing that law of do not murder, right? He's saying to truly live out that law requires a person's heart to be involved. You see, because the Pharisees could have easily just checked off the box, just like many people today. How many people in our society think this way? I'm a good person. I didn't kill anybody. How many people think that way? And that's exactly how the Pharisees thought, right? I checked the box off. I didn't murder anybody today, so I'm good. Yet Jesus rejects that idea. Jesus says, not only just murdering somebody, he says, if you're angry with your brother, you are liable to judgment. Now, that's not to say that Jesus is equating all the earthly consequences of anger and murder. Right? Surely we all can tell the difference. If somebody murders somebody, the earthly consequences play out much more severely than just being angry with somebody. Right? So Jesus isn't equating the earthly consequences. But he is saying, from God's perspective, God, we find out in Jeremiah, God tests the heart and the mind of people. And so he says, it's not just did you morally conduct yourself, but is your heart in the right place? And don't try to separate the 3 things that Jesus says, right? He says, right, if you're angry with your brother, or if you insult your brother, or if you say, you fool, right? Those are just 3 examples of the same heart. Right? Jesus isn't saying, well, this one since it's liable to the council, and this one since it's liable to hell. Right? He's not trying to differentiate between those things and say one's worse than the other. Yeah, the whole point is, if your heart is in the wrong place, you're guilty. That's what the word liable means. It means you're guilty of sin. And so living out the law means we must guard our hearts from anger, not just make sure, okay, I didn't kill anybody. And so what we find out about kingdom life in this first example is kingdom life values relationships over revenge. Kingdom life values relationships over revenge. Right? Because at first instinct, when we're angry, what do we want? I want them to feel pain too. Right? Revenge. Or I want to make sure they know that I'm right. Right? That's the temptation. Right? That's what our hearts want to chase after. Revenge. Right? Pride. And yet, in the kingdom, we value the relationship more than we value the revenge. We value people more than we value pride. And Christ is the perfect example of this. Jesus had every right to be angry with us. And he could have stayed in his exalted state with the Father and said, yep, judge them. Give them what they deserve. Yet, he emptied himself, humbled himself, all so that we might be reconciled to God. And so that's the second part, and this is what Jesus actually gives in his illustrations for us. Kingdom life, because it prioritizes, because it values people, it seeks reconciliation. Did you hear those 2 illustrations? If you're at the altar, if you're giving a gift in worship to God, but you realize your brother has something against you. I want you to just, for a moment, take that in, what that means. That doesn't mean you're angry with them because they hurt you. That means they're upset with you because you offended them. Right? In Matthew 18, we'll see the flip. In Matthew 18, we'll see if you have someone who's hurt you, you are to go to them and seek reconciliation. But this says, if you're the one who did the offending, you're supposed to go. And it says, do it quickly, right? Leave your gift at the altar and go be reconciled to them. And this will be taught later on as well in Romans 12:18. Paul's going to say the words, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with one another. Be reconciled to one another. In fact, we already saw this in the Beatitudes. Blessed are the peacemakers. Because that's rooted in the fact that all of us, hopefully, recognize our own poverty in spirit. And we all have mourned our own unrighteousness. And so now we recognize God and our unrighteousness has come to reconcile us to himself. And so the only proper response is for us to do the same thing. To look at someone who's treated us unrighteously or someone we've treated unrighteously and say, I want to go reconcile with them. Or you look at the second illustration, right? You say if someone's accused you of something and you're on your way to that person with court, come to terms, right? Come to reconciliation with that person before you ever get to court. So you don't have to experience the judgment that might come. There's echoes of Ephesians 4:26 there where Paul says, don't let the sun go down on your anger, right? Find reconciliation as quickly as you possibly can. And so ask yourselves the question, does a reconciling heart accurately describe your life? Are you someone that's quick to seek reconciliation? Husbands, are we quick to confess our sin to our wives when we've sinned against them? Wives, is your priority with your husband peace or making sure he feels guilty for what he did? Parents, when you've been impatient with your children or when you've neglected your children, are you swift to come in and make it right? To confess your sin to them and reconcile with them? Or even zooming out, how about us as a church? Do we have a culture in our church of confession and forgiveness to one another? Fulfilling the law as Christ fulfilled it means we desire reconciliation over anger. That's the heart of the law. That's what it means to not murder one another. So that's the first example. The second example Jesus works on is the pure heart. And again, another 10 commandment many of us are familiar with. You've heard it said, do not commit adultery. Now again, how easy is it to check that box off without ever having any godliness in your life, right? How many ungodly people in the world just still never commit adultery? Right? You can check that box off, right? I never participated in such acts. But Jesus says, oh, I want so much better for you. He says, but I tell you, anyone who even looks at a woman with lustful intent. Now that phrase there is kind of hard to translate in the Greek. It literally translates as simply as if you have a desire for that other person. Right? So it literally says if you're desiring someone that's not the person you're married to. That's it. That's what it means to commit adultery with that person. Right? So think about it. When you want something that's not what you have, you automatically become discontent with what you have. Think of kids. Kids do this all the time, right? They're playing with a toy, but they see someone else's toy, and they're immediately discontent with the one that they have, and they want to go find a way to get that one. Adults don't work all that different. Right? We might be a little more disguised with it. We might try to hide it a little more, but particularly here, right, he's talking about marriage and other people and the thoughts that we have and the desires that we have. And here we find out God cares about whether your desires are pure or not. And Jesus enables you to fight what it means to covet. Jesus enables you to be content, to be joyful about what the Lord has given you. So we find out kingdom life values purity over perks. Values purity over perks. And we already saw this in the Beatitudes, right? Blessed are the pure in heart. Because at first glance, lust promises some sort of perk, doesn't it? This will be pleasurable, whether it's participating in the act of adultery or just lingering it in your mind and in your heart, right? It promises some sort of pleasure, some sort of perk to you. But did you hear in the midst of this what Jesus says those perks lead to? Ultimately, your whole body be thrown into hell. Right? So the perk of pleasure ultimately leads to judgment and destruction. And we saw this with Jesus too. Jesus was tempted in every way that we were, but particularly you think of Satan tempting Jesus. He tempted him with perks. Jesus, I will give you all the kingdoms of the earth, but you have to corrupt yourself by bowing down to me. Right? It's the same promise. It's the same similar perks. Right? And so what we find out is if you're in the kingdom, you care about your soul's integrity. And because you want your soul to be pure, you say, I will reject the temporary perks that are offered by the earthly kingdoms. And you see, Jesus describes what it looks like to fight against these perks and to remain pure. Kingdom life radically amputates sin. These are violent illustrations. If your right eye causes you to sin, tear it out and throw it away. If your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. That is violent language. It is radical amputation that we must step into if we want to keep ourselves pure. And one thing I appreciate here is, while Jesus is clearly talking about lust in kind of a sexual, intimate manner here, John Piper describes this at one point, and he says, one thing he wished he learned earlier in life is the radical amputation language of these verses applies to non-sexual sin. And man, we should grasp that. To say it's not just about having a desire for the other person, but thinking about that kingdom people want to sever all sin from their lives, and will do so radically if necessary. So the question is, how aggressive are you in your pursuit of purity? How aggressive are you to cut off anger? How aggressive are you to cut off greed? How aggressive are you to cut off fear? How aggressive are you to cut off control? All of those things are still impure things. Do you seek to sever them from your life? Right, so one thing our security team went through recently was some training from someone from another church, and in that training, in that discussion, we were talking about tourniquets, right? And this is what I think of in this situation, right? He was telling us how you should have your tourniquet opened up and ready so that if any time it's needed, you immediately put it on the person and you tighten that down, right? What's the point, right? You want to remove pressure, right? Remove circulation from that to protect the health of that person. Is that how you think about sin? Man, I notice I'm struggling with this. I want to put the tourniquet, I want to remove the pressure, the circulation towards that sin as quickly as I possibly can and as tightly as I possibly can right now. I want to get that circulation towards that sin out of the way. I'm going to cut it off. To fulfill the law as Christ did means we want a heart that is pure before God. And so we cut off anything that's going to get in the way. And we come to the last one, what I might call the committed heart. Now this one's a little bit more complicated because there's a little more context. This isn't just one of the 10 commandments, right? This is a little deeper than that, but it is linked to adultery. And so what had happened in this day and age was it was said, and was a law. This is found in Deuteronomy chapter 24, right? If a husband wants to divorce the wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce. In Deuteronomy chapter 24, this was told, if a husband finds any indecency in his wife, he should give her a certificate of divorce, right? And the reason for the certificate was so that she could go out and remarry legally. Because if he divorced her without a certificate, she had no proof that she had been divorced, right? So it left her hanging, that she wasn't allowed to remarry and be helped by another husband financially in a world that where men predominantly have the finances and the property and things of that sort. But there's debate here. In Deuteronomy 24, what does it mean if he finds any indecency in her? Right? Now, some will say that means only on the wedding night. If he finds that she had been lying about her purity up until the wedding and finds out on the wedding night that she was impure, he could give her a certificate of divorce and send her on her way. Some would argue this means indecency anytime during their marriage. Right? If he ever found her to be impure and disloyal to him in the midst of the marriage, he could give her the certificate. Right? We're not here to debate that. That's not the point. The point is, the religious leaders had taken that so far as to say indecency is she cooked a meal you didn't like. Indecency was she argued with you that night. And that's what had saturated the culture. Sound familiar? There's a reason why no-fault divorce has become so popular in our culture and society. Whatever reason you find, just sign the paper and send her on her way. Right? It was an easy process. One simple signature, send her, and the marriage was done. And Jesus is saying that's not at all how God intended for marriage to work. And so he says, the problem here is, as the husband sends her on her way, if she has not committed some sort of immorality, impurity here, he's sending her into adultery. But on the flip side, now this was radical. Jesus says, if you as a husband, as a man, marry a woman who's been divorced, you're also committing adultery. Right? It was always put on the woman up until this point. Jesus saying, no. Both of you, right? Both men and women are committing adultery if you're being this flippant with your marriages and just sending each other on their way for whatever reason you want that day. Now, the temptation for us is to read these verses and be like, well, what's the exception, right? When is it okay, right? Adultery, abuse, abandonment, right? Those are kind of the 3 A words we use sometimes for when it's okay to get divorced. But that's missing the point. Jesus' focus is not on the exception. Jesus' whole focus is on what should be normal. And he says it should be normal for you to stay with each other. That should be the normative, right? Yes, there's exceptions here, but Jesus isn't talking about here's all the reasons, here's all the exceptions. His whole point is you shouldn't want to be setting someone else into adultery, and you yourself shouldn't want to be stepping into adultery. So you should be staying with each other as much as you possibly can. So what we find here is kingdom life values commitment over comfort. For Jewish men, it was really comfortable, if I was unhappy in that moment, to just send her away. But Jesus says, I want you to stay with your commitment of the marriage covenant that you have made. My friends, it would have been real easy for Jesus to stay comfortable, to stay in the heavens with the Father and sit on the throne, right? Sit at the right hand of the Father, never come. But he was committed to the Father and to our salvation. And so what we find here is for kingdom people, we should hold marriage with high esteem, and we don't leave just because it got hard. And so overall, we see kingdom life pursues faithfulness to what really matters. And we could zoom this out beyond marriage, right? Certainly, we would say, even beyond divorce, your spouse is not meant to just be used and then neglected. Right? They're not meant to just be used of, okay, you got X, Y, and Z done. That's what I wanted done today. Okay, I'm not going to give you any attention the rest of the day or not be intentional with you the rest of our lives because you've got these things done. Same thing with church, right? Church isn't meant to say, okay, how can I profit today? Okay, I'm done. See you later. Right? That's not what church is for you to commit yourself, not just for you to stay comfortable. And God's the same way. God doesn't just give you an insurance policy. Here, you're secure for all eternity. Now go do what you want. You can toss me aside. Fulfilling the law is staying committed to the things that God has commanded you to be committed to. God has ordained a specific way of life for us to live, and we are to commit ourselves to that. So hopefully you hear in all three of these examples, the entire message of the whole sermon, but especially today, God cares about all of it. God cares about every moment, every second of every day. He doesn't just care if you're divorced or not. He cares about the heart in your marriage. He doesn't just care about whether you committed adultery or not. He cares about your purity of heart all the time. He doesn't just care if you murdered or not, but he cares whether you're constantly reconciling with people or not. Christ came not just to save you, Christ came to change you. So, I'm assuming most of you sitting here this morning claim to be in the kingdom. If you claim, as someone who does claim to be in the kingdom of heaven, are you truly living the law? How consistent, how intentional are you giving attention to your heart every second, every day? That's what the Lord requires of us. That's what it looks like to live the law. Let's pray.